This is a true story told by an American traveler on a forum in 2012. James Carter had always been drawn to the unknown. As a seasoned traveler and amateur survivalist, he had explored remote regions across the world, but nothing captivated him quite like the Amazon rainforest. The vast, untamed wilderness held secrets that few had ever uncovered. Legends of lost civilizations, hidden tribes, and creatures unknown to science fueled his curiosity. And so, in the summer of 2012, he found himself deep in the heart of the Amazon, ready for his greatest adventure yet. His journey began in Manaus, Brazil, where he hired a local guide named Diego to help navigate the unforgiving terrain. They traveled by boat down the Rio Negro, the dark waters cutting through the endless sea of green. For days, they ventured deeper into the rainforest, far beyond the reaches of civilization. The air was thick with humidity, and the chorus of unseen creatures filled the night. James kept a detailed journal of everything he saw: vibrant birds with iridescent feathers, massive trees older than any human civilization, and insects of impossible colors and sizes. He felt alive in the wilderness, far removed from the distractions of modern life. On the sixth day of the expedition, they set up camp near a small tributary. Diego warned James about the dangers of the jungle: jaguars, venomous snakes, and territorial tribes that had never made contact with the outside world. James listened carefully, but deep down, he was eager to see something extraordinary. The night was restless. The jungle never truly slept. James lay in his hammock, listening to the symphony of chirping insects, rustling leaves, and distant howls. A strange unease settled in his chest, though he couldn't explain why. He was used to the unpredictability of nature, but this felt different, like something was watching them from the darkness. Morning arrived with a thick mist hanging over the trees. As James packed his gear, Diego spoke in hushed tones. "Something is wrong," he said. "The jungle is too quiet." James paused, realizing that the usual chorus of birds and insects was absent. A heavy silence loomed over the rainforest, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. That was when James saw it: a series of strange, human-like footprints in the damp earth. But they were unlike any he had seen before. The toes were elongated, the arch unnaturally deep. They led into the trees, disappearing into the shadows of the unknown. James felt a shiver crawl down his spine. His adventure had truly begun. James stood frozen, staring at the strange footprints in the mud. His first instinct was to follow them, to uncover the mystery, but Diego's voice brought him back to reality. "We shouldn't follow those," Diego warned, his voice low and strained. "There are things in these forests you don't want to find." James glanced at him, skeptical. Diego had lived most of his life in the Amazon, guiding adventurers and researchers through its dense wilderness. But his reaction was unlike any James had seen before. This wasn't the usual caution one might expect from a guide. It was fear. "What do you mean?" James asked, his voice carrying the intrigue of a man driven by curiosity. Diego hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a hushed tone. "There are stories about tribes that never make contact with the outside world. They live deep in the forest, and they don't take kindly to strangers." James nodded, trying to suppress his excitement. He had heard rumors of such tribes, groups so isolated from civilization that they hadn't even been documented by anthropologists. The idea of encountering one of them, of observing their way of life, was exactly the sort of thing he had dreamed of. But Diego wasn't done. "They are different. They know the forest in ways we can't even understand. They can disappear into it without a trace. If they don't want you to find them, you never will." James wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He had already ventured into some of the most dangerous places on Earth, and this was no different. In fact, it was precisely what he had come here for: the unknown. "We'll just follow them for a while," James said, trying to reassure Diego. "We don't need to get close. We'll keep our distance." Diego's eyes flickered with unease, but he said nothing more. He packed his gear in silence, clearly uncomfortable with the direction their journey was taking. As they trekked deeper into the jungle, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew thicker, the shadows longer, and the sounds of the forest more ominous. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, just beyond the trees. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it, a presence lurking in the undergrowth, just out of sight. The path was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. The trees seemed to close in around them, their trunks twisted and gnarled, as if the forest itself was trying to keep them away. The footprints they had followed seemed to disappear and reappear, leading them in circles. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, James realized they had lost their way. The jungle had swallowed them whole, and there was no clear path back. The only thing they could do was press forward. "We need to make camp," James said, turning to Diego, but the guide was already staring into the distance, his face pale. "Something's not right," Diego muttered. "We shouldn't be here." James ignored his fears and set to work, gathering wood for a fire. But as the flames flickered to life, the air grew still. The usual sounds of the jungle had fallen silent once more. No birds, no insects, just an eerie quiet that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. As the night drew on, the unease in the air only deepened. James couldn't help but feel that they weren't alone. He kept his eyes on the shadows at the edge of the firelight, half expecting to see a figure emerge from the dark. And then, just as he was about to nod off, a strange rustling sound echoed from the underbrush. It was faint, but unmistakable. It was the sound of something large moving through the forest, and it was coming closer. Diego tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the machete at his side. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. James nodded, his heart racing. But whatever was out there, it didn't make a sound beyond the rustling. No footsteps, no breathing, just the quiet, unsettling movement of something unseen. Suddenly, a shadow passed between the trees, just a glimpse, too quick for James to make out what it was. "We need to go," Diego said urgently, his voice trembling. James hesitated. He wanted to know more, to see what was out there. But the look in Diego's eyes told him everything he needed to know. They were being watched. They gathered their things in a rush and hurried to put out the fire. But the feeling of being hunted lingered, pressing in on them from every side. As they moved deeper into the jungle, James couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was tracking their every step. The hunt had begun. James and Diego moved cautiously through the thick jungle, their senses heightened by the eerie silence that surrounded them. The distant rustling had stopped, but the uneasy feeling of being watched remained. The fire was out, and the night was swallowing the last remnants of light. Diego led the way, his machete cutting through the dense vegetation as quietly as possible. James followed closely behind, his breath steady but his heart pounding in his chest. "Where are we going?" James whispered. Diego hesitated before answering. "Away from here. We can't stay in one place. If they're watching us, they'll know where we are." James swallowed hard. "You think it's them?" Diego didn't answer. He just kept moving. After nearly an hour of trekking through the darkness, Diego finally stopped in a small clearing. Moonlight barely pierced through the jungle canopy above, but it was just enough for them to see. "We rest here," Diego said, lowering his pack. "Not for long." James sat down on a fallen log, wiping the sweat from his brow. His body ached from the endless walking, but his mind was too alert to relax. "Tell me the truth, Diego," he said, keeping his voice low. "What do you know about these people? Have you seen them before?" Diego hesitated. He stared at the ground for a moment before finally speaking. "I've never seen them," he admitted, "but I've heard the stories." James leaned in, listening intently. "There are tribes in the Amazon that don't want to be found," Diego continued. "Some of them are peaceful. Others are not." James nodded. He had read about isolated tribes before, some of which had violently rejected contact with the outside world. But something in Diego's tone suggested there was more to this than just an uncontacted group of people. "And this tribe?" James asked. "The one we're dealing with?" Diego shook his head. "No one speaks of them. The locals avoid these parts of the jungle. They say they are different." James frowned. "Different how?" Diego sighed, rubbing his temples. "They don't just live in the jungle. They are part of it. They move without a sound. They leave no tracks. If they don't want to be seen, you will never find them. But if they want to find you..." He trailed off, shaking his head. James exhaled slowly. "You think they're hunting us?" Diego met his gaze, his expression grim. "I think they already know we're here." A shiver ran down James's spine. He had come to the Amazon seeking adventure, hoping to uncover the unknown. But now, he wasn't sure if he had found something truly remarkable or something he was never meant to see. The jungle around them was silent, too silent. No insects, no birds, nothing. Then, in the distance, a faint sound reached James's ears, a rhythmic, low hum, almost like a chant. It was distant but unmistakable. James turned to Diego. "Do you hear that?" Diego's face had gone pale. "We need to move. Now." Without another word, they grabbed their belongings and disappeared into the jungle once more, the haunting chant echoing behind them. They were not alone. James and Diego pushed through the dense undergrowth, their movements quick but cautious. The eerie chant behind them had faded, swallowed by the vastness of the jungle, but its echo remained in James's mind. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the jungle itself was resisting his presence. Diego led the way, his machete slicing through vines with controlled precision. James followed close behind, his eyes scanning the trees, half expecting to see shadowy figures watching them. "How much farther?" James whispered. Diego didn't answer right away. He glanced at the sky through a small opening in the canopy, judging the time. "A little more. We need to find a safe place before sunrise." James frowned. "Why before sunrise?" Diego hesitated, then finally spoke. Diego finally broke the silence. "Because at sunrise, they move." James's heart skipped a beat. "Who moves?" Diego didn't answer right away. Instead, he quickened his pace, forcing James to struggle through the thick vegetation to keep up. The jungle around them felt suffocating, the air heavy with humidity and an unshakable tension. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing near a fallen tree. Diego gestured for James to sit while he searched the area. James wiped the sweat from his forehead. "You keep talking like something is out here. What did we hear back there?" Diego sighed. "A ritual. One of many. This jungle is old, and some tribes, they do things outsiders shouldn't see." James felt a chill crawl down his spine. "But we're far enough now, right?" Before Diego could answer, a rustling sound came from the trees behind them. James turned, his breath caught in his throat. Through the dense foliage, two faint glowing eyes stared at them. They blinked once, then vanished into the darkness. James's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared into the dark foliage where the glowing eyes had been. His body tensed, every instinct telling him to run, but Diego remained still, watching the trees with a grim expression. "Was that an animal?" James whispered, his voice barely audible. Diego shook his head slowly. "No." James swallowed hard. "Then what was it?" Diego glanced at him, his face unreadable. "We shouldn't stay here." Without another word, he grabbed James by the arm and led him deeper into the jungle, away from the fallen tree and the unseen watcher. The dense vegetation swallowed them whole, branches clawing at their clothes as they moved quickly and silently. James wanted to ask more, but he sensed that now wasn't the time. Instead, he focused on keeping up, his mind racing with possibilities. He had read about uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, people who lived completely isolated from the modern world. But something about Diego's behavior unsettled him. This wasn't just fear of an ordinary tribe. After nearly an hour of navigating the thick jungle, Diego finally slowed down. They reached a small, shallow stream, its water reflecting the dim moonlight filtering through the canopy. Diego crouched beside the water, motioning for James to do the same. "Listen carefully," he said in a hushed tone. "We are close to their land now. You must not make noise. If they hear us—" He hesitated. James leaned in. "If they hear us, what?" Diego looked into the jungle with wary eyes. "Then we pray they don't see us first." James's heartbeat pounded in his ears as he crouched by the stream, his muscles tense. Diego's words echoed in his mind. "We pray they don't see us first." The thick jungle around them was eerily silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. James scanned the darkness, feeling exposed despite the cover of vegetation. "Who are they?" James finally asked in a whisper. Diego hesitated before answering. "An old tribe, very old. No one knows how long they have lived here. They do not welcome outsiders." James frowned. "But there are many uncontacted tribes in the Amazon, right? Most just avoid people." Diego gave him a hard look. "This is not like other tribes. They do not just avoid, they protect." James shivered at the way Diego said the word. "Protect what?" Diego didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for James to follow as they moved parallel to the stream, walking carefully to avoid making noise. The moonlight barely reached them through the dense canopy, casting ghostly shadows on the forest floor. After a few minutes, Diego suddenly stopped, raising a hand. James froze. Something was moving in the trees. A soft rustling, rhythmic and deliberate, circled them from multiple directions. It wasn't the chaotic movement of an animal. It was calculated, controlled. James's breath caught in his throat. They weren't alone. Diego grabbed his arm and whispered urgently, "We leave. Now." James didn't argue. They turned back the way they had come, moving swiftly but silently. But after only a few steps, Diego halted again, eyes wide. James followed his gaze, and his stomach dropped. Bare feet, half hidden behind the trees, barely visible in the dim light, were several pairs of feet, motionless, watching. They had been surrounded. James's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the bare feet in the darkness. They were close, too close. Yet the owners remained eerily still, blending with the jungle's shadows. He couldn't see their faces, only the vague outlines of their forms, partially obscured by the trees. Diego's grip on James's arm tightened. His breathing was slow, controlled, but James could feel the tension in his body. "Do not run," Diego whispered, barely moving his lips. "They are watching. If we run, they will chase." James swallowed hard. His instincts screamed at him to bolt, but he forced himself to stay still. For what felt like an eternity, neither he nor Diego moved. The figures remained in place, silent and motionless, as if testing them. The only sounds were the distant calls of night creatures and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the watchers melted back into the jungle. No footsteps, no noise, just gone. James exhaled shakily. "What the hell was that?" Diego let go of his arm and took a slow step back. "We were lucky." "Lucky? How is that lucky?" Diego didn't answer immediately. Instead, he scanned the darkness, his expression unreadable. "They let us go." James shivered. He realized his shirt was damp with sweat. The air was humid, but the cold dread seeping into his bones had nothing to do with the temperature. "We should leave this area," Diego said finally. "Now." James nodded quickly. The jungle around them suddenly felt more oppressive, the trees towering over them like silent sentinels. They moved cautiously, stepping carefully to avoid making too much noise. Diego led the way, following a different path than before, taking them away from the stream and deeper into the jungle. James kept glancing over his shoulder, expecting to see the watchers again. But they were gone, vanished as if they had never been there. Still, the uneasy feeling in his gut told him one thing. They weren't alone, and they never had been. James followed Diego through the dense jungle, his pulse still pounding from their eerie encounter. Every sound, the crunch of leaves, the distant calls of animals, even his own breathing felt amplified, as if the jungle itself was alive and listening. Diego moved with precision, his steps calculated, his ears always attuned to their surroundings. James envied his calm demeanor, but he could tell the guide was just as disturbed as he was. Diego's eyes darted around, scanning the trees, the shadows, the darkness between the leaves. After what felt like an hour of silent trekking, Diego finally stopped near a fallen tree. He turned to James, his expression serious. "We rest here." James hesitated, his body still tense. "Are you sure it's safe?" Diego exhaled through his nose, then gestured for James to sit. "Nowhere is safe, but moving without rest is worse. We must keep our minds sharp." James reluctantly sat on the damp log, wiping sweat from his forehead. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Who were they?" he finally asked. "Those people watching us?" Diego looked past him, as if expecting to see something in the trees. "Uncontacted. They do not know our world, and we do not know theirs." James frowned. "If they wanted to hurt us, wouldn't they have done it already?" Diego nodded. "Perhaps, but they are cautious. They watch first. They decide." The words sent a chill down James's spine. "Decide what?" Diego didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for James to stay quiet. He listened. James strained his ears, but all he could hear was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Yet Diego's expression was hard, his muscles tense. "We are still being watched," Diego finally whispered. James's stomach clenched. He wanted to turn around, to look into the jungle behind him, but he resisted the urge. Diego's hand tightened around the handle of his machete. "They are not leaving us alone." James felt a slow, creeping realization settle over him. They had not escaped. They were being studied. James could feel it now, that suffocating sensation of being watched. The jungle, once merely an overwhelming maze of green, now felt like it had eyes in every direction. Diego stayed still, his body tense, listening. James followed his lead, gripping the straps of his backpack as if it would somehow make him feel more secure. A faint rustling in the trees. Not the wind. Not an animal. Something else. James swallowed hard. His instincts screamed at him to run, but Diego had warned him before. Panic could get a man killed in the jungle. After a long, agonizing moment, Diego whispered, "We keep moving. Slowly. Do not run." James nodded, his body stiff with fear. Every step forward felt wrong, like he was trespassing where he didn't belong. The further they went, the heavier the air became, thick with tension. Then Diego suddenly stopped. James nearly bumped into him. Ahead of them, on the narrow path, was something new, a structure. It wasn't natural, a totem of some kind, crudely made, yet deliberately placed. It was tall, wrapped in vines decorated with bones, small animal skulls, dried feathers, and something else James didn't want to identify. The air around it was wrong, thick settling. Diego exhaled slowly. "This is a warning." James's mouth went dry. "Warning for what?" Diego hesitated. "For us." James turned, scanning the trees behind them. He couldn't see anyone, but he didn't have to. He could feel them, unseen figures lurking just beyond the leaves, hidden yet present, watching, waiting. James's breath came in shallow, controlled inhales as he stood frozen beside Diego, staring at the eerie totem. The bones rattled softly as a breeze passed through, as if whispering a message neither of them could understand. Diego was the first to move. He reached into his belt and pulled out a machete, holding it tightly. "We should go. Now." James nodded, but couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. He turned, scanning the dense jungle, convinced that unseen eyes were burning into his back. He still couldn't see anything. But he knew. They were there. The two of them stepped around the totem carefully, making sure not to disturb it. Diego led the way, his steps precise, barely making a sound on the damp jungle floor. James followed, but every crack of a twig beneath his boots made him flinch. For what felt like an eternity, they walked in silence. The jungle noises had changed. The usual hum of insects, the occasional distant call of a bird, even the rustling of leaves, all of it had quieted. It was unnatural. Too quiet. James licked his dry lips. "Diego," he whispered, "are we being followed?" Diego didn't answer at first. He only walked faster, his knuckles white around the handle of the machete. "We do not stop. We do not look back," he finally said. "If you see something, do not react." James felt his skin prickle with cold sweat. If he saw something, that meant Diego already had. A branch snapped somewhere behind them. James flinched but kept his eyes forward, focusing on Diego's steady pace. Another snap, closer this time. Then a breath. A deep, slow exhale from something that wasn't them. James clenched his jaw. His instincts screamed at him to turn around, to look. But Diego's warning rang loud in his head. Do not look back. His heart pounded violently against his ribs as they quickened their pace, moving through the thick undergrowth, the dense vines clawing at their clothing. Another sound. Footsteps. Soft. Deliberate. Multiple sets. They weren't alone. James wanted to run. Every fiber of his being urged him to bolt, but Diego kept walking, his movements calm, controlled. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Diego whispered, "We are close to the river. Keep moving." James swallowed and did as he was told. But the oppressive feeling of being watched never left, because whoever was behind them, whatever was following them, wasn't going away. The sound of rushing water grew louder as they approached the river. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt thicker now, dense with the tension that had been building since they had first ventured into the jungle. Every shadow seemed like it could conceal something watching them, waiting. Diego led the way with unshaken resolve, but even he couldn't hide the slight wariness in his steps. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing. James followed his gaze, but there was nothing. Still, that feeling of being pursued clawed at him. As they neared the water's edge, the dense trees began to thin, the jungle opening up to a wide river that stretched out before them like an endless expanse. The river was fast-moving, its dark waters swirling beneath the trees. On the opposite bank, the thick, untouched jungle continued as if the river separated two worlds. "This is where we make camp." Diego said, stopping abruptly. James blinked. Here? Now? Diego didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crouched down near the bank, pulling out a small knife and beginning to scrape at the bark of a tree. The river is our boundary. We stay here tonight. James wasn't sure what he meant by that, but the urgency in Diego's voice made him comply. He set his backpack down on the ground, feeling the weight of the situation pressing in. They were in uncharted territory, and every decision seemed more critical than the last. Diego finally stood, his face grim. The people of the jungle know this place. They will not cross it. James's mind raced. What are you talking about? Who are they? Diego looked around, ensuring no one was listening, and then nodded toward the far side of the river. The people across the river, the ones who do not welcome outsiders. James felt a shiver run down his spine. But they're not here, right? Diego didn't answer directly. Instead, he gathered some dry leaves and started a small fire. The crackling of the fire seemed almost loud in the unnatural stillness around them. James sat down, trying to calm his breathing, but something still didn't feel right. The jungle was silent again, too silent. He kept his gaze fixed on the river, but his mind kept drifting back to the forest behind them. The footsteps. The strange sounds they had heard earlier were still fresh in his memory, like a persistent echo. Suddenly, a rustling sound broke the silence, coming from the thick jungle behind them. It was subtle at first, but unmistakable. Someone or something was there. James tensed, his muscles coiling in anticipation. He glanced over at Diego, whose eyes were trained on the trees. There was no panic in his gaze, only the calm certainty of someone who had seen it all before. Diego slowly rose to his feet, his hand reaching for his machete. "Do not move," he said, his voice low and steady. "Stay close." James nodded, his heart racing. The rustling grew louder now, unmistakable. Footsteps. Human? Animal? He couldn't tell, but it was coming closer. James's thoughts raced. What was out there? What had they stumbled into? His hand instinctively tightened around his backpack strap. A shadow moved at the edge of the trees. James held his breath. Then, a figure stepped into the light. It was a man, but unlike any man James had ever seen. His skin was dark, almost like the earth itself, and his hair was wild and tangled. He was covered in simple cloths, and his eyes gleamed with an intelligence that made James shiver. The man stopped at the edge of the river, not crossing it, but watching them. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound, only studied them with piercing eyes. Diego didn't flinch. He stood his ground. His machete held at his side, but his posture was calm. "The watchman," he murmured. "He is a guardian of the river." James's mind spun. A guardian? The figure remained silent, but his gaze never wavered from them. He was watching for something, waiting. For a long moment, the only sound was the rushing of the river. The tension in the air thickened, and James felt a sense of dread creep into his bones. Then, as silently as he had appeared, the man turned and melted back into the jungle. Diego relaxed but didn't speak immediately. James stared at the spot where the figure had vanished, still unsure of what had just happened. Finally, Diego spoke. "We are safe, for now, but do not forget, this place is not ours. We are guests here, nothing more." James could only nod, his mind still racing with questions. But one thing was certain. This was only the beginning of something much bigger. The jungle, the people, and the strange magic that seemed to pulse in the air. He hadn't even begun to understand what he had gotten himself into. The night air was thick with humidity, the scent of damp earth and burning wood mingling as James and Diego sat near the small fire. The encounter with the mysterious figure by the river still weighed on James's mind. He had vanished so seamlessly into the jungle, as if he had never been there in the first place. James shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the trees on the far bank of the river. The weight of the night pressed in around them, an oppressive silence hanging in the air. "You called him a guardian," James finally said. "What does that mean?" Diego poked at the fire with a stick, his expression unreadable. "He watches the river. He watches for outsiders." James furrowed his brow. "Like us?" Diego exhaled, nodding. "But he was not here for us, not yet." James swallowed hard. Then, who was he watching for? Diego didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a small cloth bundle. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing what looked like a handful of dried leaves and small bones. Whispering something under his breath, he tossed the leaves into the fire. The flames crackled and flared, turning an eerie shade of blue for a brief moment before settling back into their natural orange glow. James tensed. "What was that?" Diego didn't look at him. "A precaution." James didn't like that answer. The night was quiet, too quiet. The jungle, usually alive with the sounds of insects and nocturnal creatures, had fallen into an unnatural stillness. Then, just beyond the reach of the fire's glow, came the sound of movement. James's breath hitched. It wasn't the sharp crack of a branch underfoot, nor the rustling of an animal moving through the brush. It was softer, slower, like the deliberate steps of someone trying not to be heard. He exchanged a glance with Diego, who was already gripping his machete tightly. "Stay low," Diego whispered. James obeyed, crouching near the fire, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The sound came again, closer. James turned his head toward the jungle behind them, his eyes straining to see through the darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, movement. A shifting shadow, blending so seamlessly with the trees that he almost doubted it was real. Diego inhaled sharply. "They are here." James's stomach turned to ice. "Who?" Diego's voice was barely above a breath. "The ones who do not welcome outsiders." James swallowed hard, his fingers curling into fists. His first instinct was to run, but Diego didn't move. He remained crouched, eyes locked on the trees. The rustling stopped. Silence. James's skin prickled. They were being watched. Seconds passed like hours, stretching the moment into unbearable tension. Then, without warning, the jungle came alive again. Crickets chirped, distant animals called, and the eerie quiet was gone. The watchers, whoever they were, had retreated. Diego exhaled, lowering his machete. They were only looking. James let out a shaky breath. "Looking for what?" Diego met his gaze, his expression grave. "To see if we are worth following." A cold chill ran down James's spine. He wasn't sure which was worse, the idea that they had been watched or the implication that this wasn't over yet. James barely slept that night. Every rustling leaf, every distant animal call sent his nerves on edge. He knew they had been watched, silent figures hiding among the trees, observing them from the darkness. But why? And more importantly, would they return? When dawn broke, Diego was already awake, standing by the river with his machete in hand. His expression was unreadable as he scanned the jungle, his stance tense and alert. James pushed himself up, groaning at the stiffness in his muscles. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. Diego shook his head. "It is better to stay aware." James rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the exhaustion. "Do you think they're still out there?" Diego didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pointed to the edge of their campsite. James followed his gaze and felt his stomach drop. There, etched into the dirt, was a symbol, a crude, circular shape with jagged lines running through it. It hadn't been there the night before. James knelt beside it, running his fingers over the freshly disturbed earth. "What the hell is this?" Diego exhaled slowly. A warning. James felt a chill run through him. "From who?" Diego hesitated. "The tribe. They know we are here." James's pulse quickened. "You mean the same people who don't welcome outsiders?" Diego nodded. "Yes, but this means they are watching closely now." James clenched his jaw. "So what do we do? Leave?" Diego studied the symbol for a long moment before shaking his head. "Not yet. They have not attacked. If they wanted us gone, they would have already tried." James wasn't so sure. The silence of the previous night, the feeling of being watched, it all felt like the calm before a storm. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Then what's the plan?" Diego slung his pack over his shoulder. "We move carefully. We do not disturb their land, and we do not give them a reason to act." James let out a slow breath. "And if they do act?" Diego met his gaze, his expression firm. "Then we run." The weight of those words settled heavily in James's chest. He glanced back at the ominous symbol in the dirt before turning to the dense jungle ahead. They weren't alone, and now it was only a matter of time before the tribe made their next move. James and Diego moved cautiously through the jungle, their steps careful and deliberate. The deeper they ventured, the more James felt an unshakable presence around them, an eerie awareness that they were being observed. The jungle had grown unnervingly silent. Even the usual hum of insects and distant calls of wildlife seemed subdued, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. James wiped the sweat from his forehead, his heart pounding. "Are you sure we're not pushing our luck?" he whispered to Diego. Diego didn't answer immediately. His sharp eyes scanned their surroundings before he finally muttered, "We are already too deep in." James swallowed hard. What does that mean? Diego knelt beside a tree and pointed to its bark. Symbols, similar to the one they had found at their camp, had been carved into the trunk. They looked rough, hastily made, but they carried an unsettling weight. "These are boundary markers," Diego explained. "We have crossed into their sacred land." James felt a chill crawl down his spine. "You knew this, and we still came this way?" Diego stood up, adjusting his machete. "We have no choice. The way back is no safer. They are watching both directions." James exhaled shakily, glancing over his shoulder. The dense foliage seemed to move unnaturally, as if the trees themselves were shifting. Every rustle of leaves made his nerves spike. "So what now?" Diego motioned forward. "We move quickly but carefully. No sudden actions. If we act like we belong, they may let us pass." James wasn't convinced, but he had no better plan. Swallowing his fear, he followed Diego deeper into the forbidden territory. As they pushed forward, James began to notice strange things. Small totems hanging from tree branches, made of bone, twigs, and human-like figures crafted from vines. Some were arranged in clusters, others spaced apart like warnings. Then, something else caught his eye. Through the trees in a small clearing, he saw them. A group of figures, barely visible through the thick foliage, crouched near a fire. Their skin was painted in dark patterns, blending with the jungle's shadows. They were chanting in low, rhythmic voices, their bodies swaying in unison. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Diego?" he whispered. Diego had seen them too. He grabbed James's arm and slowly backed away, motioning for silence. James's pulse pounded in his ears. The air around them felt electric, charged with something ancient and terrifying. As they crept backward, one of the figures abruptly turned its head. For a brief moment, James locked eyes with it. A pair of hollow, pitch-black eyes stared back at him. James's breath hitched. His instincts screamed at him to run, but Diego's firm grip on his arm kept him in place. Then the chanting stopped. The jungle fell into complete silence. James knew without a doubt that they had been seen. The end of part 1.